live masterclass on Build and Debug Your First Enterprise RAG Pipeline, brought to you by AgileFever.
Happy Saturday, everyone. Thank you so much for joining on the weekend. Thank you so much for all the interest. And I hope we can justify this time where we learn about enterprise retrieval augmented generation. So I'll start off with a small story. So about 2 years ago, in our enterprise, we started off with a simple business use case, which was about customer bot for the client associates, account managers, and different investment advisors, if you may assume. We wanted to build a bot and leverage AI and, of course, retrieval augmented generation in order to derive business value. 2023 was a time when AI had just been rolled out, ChatGPT had been rolled out, everybody were in the experimenting phase, and we were also building a bunch of POCs, but we really wanted it to drive a business value as opposed to just experimenting and building POCs and of course moving on to the next projects. So that's how it all started. Fast forward to about 2 years, we were featured as Microsoft's customer success story for successfully deploying enterprise solution using retrieval augmented generation, which is why I'm here to tell about some of the strategies that I noticed, strategies and patterns that worked, and some of them which failed. With that, let's get started with the agenda today. So firstly, we'll see how the 2025 AI landscape evolved over the course of just 1 year, because 2023 is really when the magic started. And then secondly, we'll start seeing what exactly is, by this time RAG is already old and there's a lot of agents which is already leveraging RAG, but we will still touch on what exactly does RAG mean, how is it really being used, what are the different failures that we need to keep in mind, and what's the mitigation strategies. Finally, I also have a demo to tie all of these together, something for you to take home and also implement these strategies at your enterprises. With that, let's get started. So in 2025 start, about 42% of the AI projects failed, which means these projects were not really POCs or the demo projects or the vendor demos. These were actually projects with business values and real money, real dollars attached to it that failed. 42% is a pretty big number. And this was around, I think, June or July. That's when I pulled the statistics. And by now, I'm pretty sure the rate would have increased a lot due to so many different failure points. Within that, there's about 51% chances that these are RAG use cases, which means in our audience today, about 50% of you would have already heard about RAG and probably implemented RAG, and the other 50% might be considering using RAG. So that's a pretty big number. And finally, the S&P conducted a survey across about 1,000 companies, and 200 companies came back and said, no, RAG didn't work. It failed for so many different reasons. Maybe it's MLOps, maybe it's infrastructure, maybe it's the data strategy that they had that didn't work. So imagine just 20% of the companies that they surveyed actually told that it worked. The rest 80% said that it did not work for them, which is the reason why today I decided to focus on retrieval augmented generation. It's a pretty big topic and also a hot topic. So let's understand what is RAG. I'll give an example. Assume that you just did your MBA, you got a ton of knowledge, and you're interested with a question. How would you probably assess a vendor deal for a cybersecurity vendor at your company? If someone asks you this question, I don't think you'd be recollecting your memory and the things that you learned from MBA and say, okay, maybe I read this, maybe that's the answer, and then you don't come back and say that. Instead, what you do is you actually look at all the vendor reports, you look at the compliance and the security requirements from your company, and you also take a look at the current market trend. And you take all of this information, package it in a neat report, then present it to your senior executive who asked you this question. Right? You don't just remember from your memory and say this might be the answer. So that's exactly what RAG is. It basically retrieves the document which is very related to the use case that's at hand, and it provides it to the LLM in order to convert it into a smoothly flowing natural language, and then it generates a coherent answer by the use of the user question and the relevant data along with the LLM's natural language. So that's RAG. You might now ask, why is RAG essential? We were okay. Why do we need RAG? So if you have, I'm pretty sure you would have had this experience. If you ask any question which is related to your office policies or your office 401k policies to ChatGPT, chances are it might come back and give some very generic answer, or maybe the smarter models would say, no, I do not have this information at hand. Because in reality, it's being trained on loads and loads of data. Think about it. There's Reddit data, there's YouTube, there's a lot of Google pages that it's scraped, there's a lot of Wikipedia. So this is the data that it's being trained on. When you ask it a question which is so nuanced to your use case, it probably cannot answer because it does not have the relevant details. Secondly, at your companies, if you've observed, there's this one person who does a lot of critical activities. It could be something related to reporting, handling, maybe they're industry veterans who've been working at your company for 20, 25 years. And then all of a sudden, it's their retirement time and they have to walk out the door. What about all the documentation? What about all the business critical processes that they were handling? It's so difficult if the knowledge transfer wasn't done. And also, it's so difficult to do all of that 20 years worth of knowledge. Here's where RAG comes into picture. Thirdly, if you were looking for any database specific tools or technology, or say you wanted to write a SQL query, but you weren't sure of the field name, and you look for it in your wiki pages, you look for it in your development documents, but you're not able to find it because it's not really streamlined. That's where, again, RAG comes for SQ. Finally, when your AI chatbot from your company provides an answer, you cannot just trustly blind it. I mean, you cannot blindly just trust that answer because the auditors are definitely going to come knocking at your door asking, how exactly did it give this answer? Do you have the series of steps that it followed to give you this answer? What was the sources? How can you believe it? What if it's something that's going to cost your company millions of dollars? That's a huge loss in potential risk. So these are some of the reasons why retrieval augmented generation is super, super important. Here's one example where, as I mentioned from the previous example, they're saying, I want to renew our $50 million software vendor contract given the new cybersecurity requirements. And they ask this question to the ChatGPT or any bot as such. And what comes back is a very generic answer that you could find but not really know what to do with. I'm not sure where to find vendor security certification. I'm not sure what the current pricing is. Nor am I sure of the security audit. So how do I utilize all of this information? This is very difficult. Versus when you actually use RAG, which means you basically provide this and then you back it up with a bunch of sources that you have, then it's able to give you this very action-oriented steps along with numbers. If you see this, it says 87% of security requirements. And then it also says $12.4 million because it's looked at your data, it's looked at your documents. It's not just making up the numbers out of thin air. It also gives you very neat action points along with the sources that it looked at in order to come to this conclusion. So that's RAG. And why is RAG needed is because we get this clean trace of audit. Now, the meat of why you're here. RAG is amazing, but there's also so many weaknesses for RAG. Well, I should say the system surrounding RAG. So let's look at each of these danger zones. And I call these as danger zones because each one of these have potential to actually end the project. So let's start looking at the strategy failure. So the the template in which I would go through this is firstly talk about each of this failure point, talk about the mitigation strategies, and also show you some code so that it does not become a burden towards the end to show the code all at once. All right, strategy failures. I have heard this a lot. Since we are able to index one document, why not just index all the documents? Why don't you just index, say, for example, you have a 401k, you have a HR policy about your absence guidelines, say you have cybersecurity contract deal. Do you really think putting all of these different documents in the same index and running a RAG on them makes sense? I certainly don't think so, because that's going to cause a lot of different problems. So step one is to basically have one set of use case and have a very specific mindset on what should that index be about. Should it be only about HR documents? Should it be only for cybersecurity team? So this could be team specific or this could be document specific. Secondly, the ROI. You shouldn't be doing RAG for the sake of doing RAG. You're supposed to have numbers, which is tied to each and every project. How much money did it really save? Are we even getting any adoption from the users? Do people like our product? These are some of the questions you would need to consider from the start before actually moving through the entire process and burning through the cash. Finally, AI is not the ultimate solution. It's honestly the use cases which you have at hand. You'd need to really compare and see, do we need AI for this? A lot of times I've seen automation can do the job quite well. You wouldn't need the AI. AI is just an overkill in some of the use cases. Finally, the stakeholder wars. I've seen this happen in many companies where the businesses really love the word AI and it's such a shiny tool that they want to add it to everything. But then the actual AI engineers, they understand how much of an overkill that is. So they usually don't go in alignment, and there needs to be a lot of communication that happens between the teams, between the subject matter experts, as well as the businesses. They need to convince and come on a probably like agree midway at least. If that doesn't happen, then you're just like throwing away all the money on AI. So those are the different pitfalls for the strategy. How do you mitigate all of these different issues? Firstly, you need to select the pain point that's costing a lot of money. Say, for example, you're getting a contractor, but he's charging you like $150 an hour. That is really expensive. So that's where you got to start. You need to have the money that you're paying the contractor or or an engineer. You need to see how much time does it take for that particular person to do the work. So when you have all of these different details and then you start zeroing on the use case, that's when you're able to actually calculate the money that the AI can make for you. So once you get the numbers, you then start looking at the knowledge base. Like I mentioned, if it's a 401k specific documents, get the 401k, which is the latest, and put it in index. Do not mix that with an index that contains random other documents which is not related to that. So you would need about 5 to 10 different critical questions that it can answer. For example, how much can I contribute this year? How much did it increase by? What stocks or shares can I invest in? Those are the sort of questions that you need to come up with. And quickly start building POCs. We have so many different tools now. You could use Azure, you could use Gemini, you could use Claude. Quickly make a POC. It might not work great, it might not look great, but you need to quickly get the feedback from the users to see if it's actually helping them. Only then would you actually start building a whole product. Up until then, it's still too early for you to invest in anything. Awesome. So that's the strategy failure. So I'd like to quickly um, switch to the code version of this so that we can take a look at how exactly it works. So I would glance through all these things and I can send you this GitHub later so that you can take a look at it. So I'm currently using LangGraph. All right. So for the purpose of the demo, I've taken the Tesla documents, and within Tesla, there's different types of documents that I've considered. One is a handbook. The other one is a compensation table. The others are the SEC documents from different years. So basically setting up the OpenAI embeddings and the vector stores. And here we will start understanding what exactly strategy failure means. So let's see what are the different documents that I'm using. So remember, this is a bad strategy, right? So I'm basically bloating up the index by putting in every document that's possible. So I've used all of these documents and I'm asking the question, what are Tesla's cybersecurity risks and data protection challenges? Where do you think this should go? And we can make this interactive. So where do you think this answer should come from? Do you think it should come from the handbook? Do you think it should come from the compensation table? Okay, seems like it's Saturday and everyone's still warming up. No worries, I'm gonna say this should definitely come from the SEC documents. It should come from the either the 10K, or if depending on the use case, you would also want it from the latest year or latest month. So as of right now, it's October, so it should be coming from October. Since we don't have that, the latest is August. So that's where it should be coming from. But since we have all of these things stuffed into an index, what's happening is if you look at the answer, it, it's taking a lot of chunks from Tesla compensation table.pdf. And we are seeing a bunch from 10K as well, and there's more compensation table related. So why is this happening? Why is a cybersecurity risk and data protection challenge coming from a handbook and compensation table? Maybe because the compensation table has the words which is related to cybersecurity risk, or maybe a cybersecurity engineer's compensation, and also maybe data protection officer or something of such sort, which is the reason why we're seeing the index, which is why we're seeing the chunks, which is coming from the compensation table, which is wrong. So now let's look at the fix that we had to make in order to get this from the right document. So we first see if the question contains words which is corresponding to cybersecurity ones. So for example, risk, uncertainty, challenge, these are just a key, handful of words. So we would then look for these words and we would select which documents should risk related questions go to. So we set all of that here. So if you look at this, we first select the risk keywords here, and then in a list where we say good documents, we basically select the ones which is related to the risk. And then we are using Chroma as our data store to store all of the embeddings as well as the chunks. And by strategically reducing the number of documents, we are seeing far lesser chunks as well. We're seeing 236 chunks, which is a reduction from 965 chunks earlier. And now we see great results. So the content looks great. I would let you go through the entire thing probably after the meeting. But if you're looking at it, this definitely stands in alignment with the question that we're asking. So the key is to select and strategically select the number of documents per index, which needs to be related to the same topic. And it should also be most up to date. And we'll get to that in the next failure point, which is the data quality. All right, so let's assume that our strategy is good. We have our indexes. One has 401k, one has HR documents, one has cybersecurity documents. Second point now, data quality is so important. And I love this Jiffy for that reason. We can't just expect all the AI agents to solve our industry problems by giving it bad data. I have observed this and I've also listened to it from a lot of industry folks. They don't really have the best data strategy when it comes to AI agents consumption. AI agents are not sure what needs to be consumed. So if you are feeding it to an index and the index contains, say, for example, you have uploaded a document, your coworker has uploaded a document, it's all dated differently. There's also multiple dupes. Maybe there's metadata points which are missing. Imagine how disastrous the response is going to be from the AI. It's going to be outdated response. So we wouldn't want that, which is the reason why we have a bunch of strategies which we need to follow in order for the AI agents to zero in on the latest documents, the clear cut version. Maybe the author is somebody who is the subject matter expert and not just any one of us. So the first one is, like I mentioned, missing metadata. So there's no owner or there's no date or version. I would urge everyone to completely put guardrails and gates if there's no metadata on these particular documents. So identify the critical set of metadata points which you would need for the documents to be eligible by the AI agent's consumption. That's the first point. Secondly, there's also batch structuring. I've seen this happen a lot in a lot of financial documents. There's tables which are split across multiple pages. For example, the headers of a table is towards the end of a page, and the next page maybe has all the rows. And that's disastrous for AI agents if the overlapping is not set. So what essentially happens is if you're asking a question related to a table, maybe the table header says 500K cybersecurity deal, and then the breakdown is in the next table. It's disastrous because you're not really sure what it needs to take. It might take both the chunks, it might add it, and then it might duplicate the values. And that is the reason why we need to make sure if the tables are not really split across evenly, you have a way to set the overlapping, or you can provide PDFs which are much cleaner, which does not have that sort of broken table situation. That's just an example. And there's also a lot of inconsistent formats, especially when it comes to PDF. There's images on the right side, there's a bunch of workflows on the left side, then there's text in the middle. So all of that really contributes to the data quality other than the documents itself. Finally, the mitigation strategies for data quality. So as I mentioned, you would need to identify the most critical data points that's needed for your AI agents consumption. And in our case, for example, say if we were to ingest the Tesla documents, as I mentioned, you would need the name of the file, you would need the date, you would need who the author is, so that in case the maybe for example, the quality of the document is not up to the par, you know whom to go to. So the author needs to be non-negotiable. And in case it has some sort of stickers or any sort of fund related information, that needs to be stamped as well on the document. And metadata is the most critical thing that you can have in data quality. Secondly, any documents that does not have these needs to be blocked. You could have an automated process that checks this. You could say, for example, the length of this metadata needs to be 4, and each of these metadata needs to adhere. For example, date, it needs to adhere to the year, month, date format. It can't just have different formats. So that's super important as well, the formatting. Finally, we'd select the documents just like how we selected questions in our previous strategy mitigation. We'll also be selecting high value documents, and use the semantic aware chunking. There's also different types of chunking which you could use. There's sentence level, there's token level, there's character level chunking. You could definitely select it based on your use case, and then you would iterate over the previous RAG POC that you built and get the feedback from the user. So that's the mitigation strategy for data quality, and we can quickly check how the code does that. Can everyone see this, or is this too small? I can increase the font if not. Awesome. All right, so here's the data quality crisis, which I just talked about. Let's assume the data is not really clean, and let's assume there's a document which your coworker uploaded which does not contain the real answers. Let's say it's from previous year and that does not contain the correct revenue. So we are injecting these as fake chunks because it's essentially the same. If you have a document which does not really have the correct data, then you do the embedding and chunking. I mean, you do the chunking and then the embedding, you would still be seeing this unclean chunk. So that's what we are doing here. We're injecting the fake chunk, and we're also giving it an ID. And we're finally asking the question, what is Tesla's revenue currently? So it's supposed to be coming back with the actual answer, but since we have the fake chunk, which is injected, it could get confused in the answer. It's not gonna know in case the metadata is not correct. So the response here is Tesla compensation table, which is correct. It's not really the best result, but SEC is really the place where you get the revenue. So you would also see the final answer here, which says 10,000 million, 25,000 million. It has two different revenues. Why? Because we injected that fake chunk here, which says 10,000 million. Whereas the reality is 25,000. So it still gives you all the answers. And one might not really look at this much. One might not be very data savvy and they would just go by, yep, this is the right answer. They might pick one of the number. So that's very disastrous. And although the newer models does say that this might not be the correct answer because it has the grounding, which means it can actually look at the latest Tesla revenue data and bring it up to you, but it's still definitely a risk. And then here's the fix that we do. We basically add the different metadata that we talked about. We tell what type of report is it, what type of financial filing, what form type is it. Once we add all of that, and then we of course don't add the fake chunk because that was the test that we were doing earlier, then we see the response, which is yeah. So we basically see the response where it just comes back with one number, which is 22,496. It also comes back with all the sources which it used in order to come back with that answer. So absolutely, absolutely important is to make sure you have just one source of document, one authoritative source, not multiple. Have dates, have metadata sources, have clean data, and also the PDF formatting. Great. Moving on to the next failure, prompt engineering disasters. I'm a huge fan of prompting. I used to be, at least, right when AI just was rolled out, ChatGPT was rolled out. I call prompt engineering as the art of talking to the robots without losing my mind. Because that's what we've been doing these days, right? We've been doing a lot of chit chatting with AI, be like, hey, be natural, be more detailed, don't use the M dashes. We're just trying to do everything so that it could give us the right answer. And I've added a picture here, which really resonates with my thought. So you have the subject matter experts here. You have a doctor here, for example. Here you have two engineers, you have a lawyer, and here you have a subject matter expert, which is an AI. So all of them are experts at their own place. But the barrier is when they actually start talking to each other, because they wouldn't know the terms which AI would understand. They would use a different lingo, for example. The doctors might have acronyms, maybe for different diseases. When you ask that to AI, it's not going to be able to understand. So prompt engineering is super important, apart from the data strategy and the indexing and all the other technical different aspects. So first thing where prompt engineering could actually fall apart is context blindness. For example, if I were to get a detailed project report for one of my projects that I'm working on, if I just give a generic prompt on, hey, can you generate a project report? It's not going to do a great job. You need to provide it a different context. You need to say, hey, you are an expert, say, for example, report maker, report preparer, and this is the output format which I would need. And you could also use all of the data that you have and provide it to that in order to get more rich response. And I would also use a lot of different strategies, which is there. There's chain of thought, there's tree of thought prompting, there's so many different types. You could definitely use one of them. So using generic prompts is old. It's very outdated now. And if you're using any sort of, and if you're new to prompting, then I would definitely suggest using the custom GPTs within the chat GPT, just so that you get that understanding on how different the answers can be when you ask the same question in chat GPT versus the actual custom GPTs that they have in the GPT marketplace. That's a very good exercise. Yeah, so moving on to the domain disconnect. For example, the finance, there's so many different acronyms which could mean so many different things. For example, the performance, it has like about 5 to 6 different meanings if I think about it. I would need to define each one of these and actually give examples in terms of it. Like performance of a fund could be from a fiscal year 2024 to this 2025. And you can also say it could be performance of an intern, for example. How is the performance measured of an intern? And what is it based on? So there's definitely a lot of nuance to it, and one cannot use that loosely. You would always need to define what you mean. Finally, the static templates. This is a very scary error that happens. Say you have an enterprise rack system in production and you keep adding more and more data sets, but you're following the CI/CD pipeline for the rest of the software development process, but you forget that prompting is also part of the CI/CD pipeline. As you add new data sets, you would need to update the prompts as well so that it's in sync on what's happening. What new data set got added? What new decision should I take? Is there a good planning? Is there a good routing? If that is not done, then it's as good as the LLM ignoring your new data set that you've added. So always use CI/CD pipeline even for prompting. Finally, the nuance neglect. This is very typical. Imagine you have an intern and you have a CEO at your company. Both of them need two different things. The intern needs help with his onboarding, and the CEO needs a complete deck that needs to be prepared to propose something for his board of directors, for example. Would they use the same prompting? I don't think so. You have two very different persona, so you would need to use that sort of prompting for both of them. If you're an intern, say, hey, as an intern mentor, could you help me with the onboarding process? Here's the steps. What needs to be done next? That's how I would approach it. And for a CEO, you would definitely need to provide more information and keep it more high level. You would not delve into details. So that's nuance neglect. Um, all right, so moving on to the mitigation strategies. So first thing, select the high stakes scenario, very similar to how we have it for the data quality and the strategy. Make sure that your prompts, whatever prompts that's tied to the high risk environments and domains such as finance, legal, and reputation, these cost a lot of money in case you get it wrong. So make sure you do the auditing for these domains first. Then when you're creating the prompts, it's not exactly engineering. It's you sitting with the subject matter expertise and actually coming up with a prompt that would make sense for the system plus the business. Because me as an engineer might want to go fancy and use a lot of different prompting techniques that's in different research papers. But maybe business doesn't even need that. Maybe business wants something which is very simple, useful, and actionable. So always co-create your prompts with the SMEs who would actually be using the system and getting value out of the system. Thirdly, the role specific prompts. As I mentioned, based on the user who's using your enterprise grade rack system. If it's an intern, they need to have a different sort of prompting. If it's a CEO, they need to have a different sort of prompting. They cannot have the same prompts defined. So you would use role-based access control, for example, to identify who's using the system, and based on that, they should be able to see the answers. And then finally, the last 2 points is you do a lot of testing internally, because it's better you catch the errors before your users in production do. And we also call that the red teaming. And the faster you can break the system, the faster you can move forward, just like how Agile dictates. Finally, iterate with the live feedback. Always keep user in the loop. Make sure they know what you're doing. Make sure they know what the responses are. And if they're really liking it, if it's too large, if it's too small, how helpful is it? So iterate over that feedback and continue developing the features. So I can quickly show how the prompting affects in the same Tesla use case here. So let's look at a generic prompt here, for example. So the bad prompt, as I gave the example, was answer the question based on the context, and I'm providing the context. And I provide the question, and I'm asking for the answer. So what is, for example, let's see the question. Yeah. So this is the query right here. How should Tesla address cyber risk? And with the bad query that we've defined, which is just answer it based on the context, we're just throwing the documents at its face and say, answer. This is what I'm seeing. Seeing a huge essay like, blah, 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 risk identification, robust cybersecurity. Okay. All that is fine, but it doesn't seem really that useful to me. Like, it's okay. It doesn't have any numbers. I don't see any pros. I don't see any cons. Versus, I now go ahead and see this. I assuming I am the senior risk analyst who's asking this question. Since I already know the domain so well, I know what I'm looking for. I'm basically gonna train this like my intern and provide all the key context. Like, what are the key risks identified? What's the business impact? Mitigation, recommendation, confidence level. Like, if you're seeing, we are taking the response from 0 to 100 just by using these effective prompting strategies. So if you look at the response here, for the good prompting, you can see complete report, which is generated that it almost looks as close as you made it because it's your expertise. So it identified all the key risks. Also, it told what the severity for each one of these are. And also, it looked at the documents, so it's not hallucinating. It also gave you the business impact for each one of them. What's the mitigations? What's the recommendations? And also the confidence level. This is something which is really important because sometimes the LLMs can still hallucinate. Hallucination is still a big research area. So it helps to have confidence level low, medium, high. So I mean, I'm really impressed just by adding 5 to 6 different lines of instructions. You can make so much of difference to your prompt. So that's prompt engineering. I think we're doing okay on time. Chandana, are we doing
Yes.
okay on time or okay?
Yes, Anupama, we can continue.
Okay, awesome.
Thank you.
All right, so I will go through this fast. Probably I'll go through both Pitfall 4 and 5 and then switch to the GitHub. Finally, the Pitfall 4 is the evaluation blind spots. So think of it this way. Your RAG is working wonderfully fine. It's in prod. It's going on for about like a year and everyone's happy. Suddenly, you get an email from the auditor saying, hey, we would like to do an audit over all the things that's happening. How would that feel? That is kind of that's very concerning and nerve-wracking if you do not have all the protocols that needs to be followed while developing the RAG. So let's look at the things that needs to be done. First thing is if you have a system, you would need to know what the response and what the structure should look like. For example, if there's a question that the user is asking, you should know as the developer what the user's expected response should be looking like. Without that, proceeding is dangerous. Think of it like this. If you don't know what 3 plus 2 is, if it's not 5, then you can have so many different variations. How would you really proof check that it needs to be equal, right? That is what we call as golden data source. Having the questions along with the response is the golden source, which needs to be started right when you start the project. And this is not like an afterthought. So the minute you have the 5 documents, for example, you could use LLM for this or subject matter experts, come up with the 10 different questions which is related to that document and also come up with the 10 different responses for the same document and you have that set. That's the golden source. So that's, yeah. And once that's done, you can also use and iterate it with the live feedback from the users. So if you feel like the golden source might be changing, for example, this year's performance or this year's sticker value, today's sticker value is say $34 for a specific product, and yesterday's was a different value, you can iterate that dynamically using you can use Python, you can use the automated APIs to scrape the values from the website, of course, ethically, but you would need that feedback to compare what your RAG is providing versus what the actual ground truth is. And also make sure that you have a reporting where you can see if there's the feedback which is provided by the user. Because as your product scales, say there's about 1,000 different users, you can't really interview each one of them. So in terms of UI, make sure you have a feedback mechanism. It could be as simple as like and dislike, how ChatGPT has it. They could also provide useful comments for you so that you can iterate over your model to provide better responses. So the mitigation strategies for evaluation is pretty much going to be the same, which I just mentioned. You're creating the golden data set and make sure you have the traceability, which means every time you have a complete pipeline, you would need to store what's happening from the question up until the response. So say, for example, from the question, you would need to identify what chunks are being searched at. And I'm seeing in the chat, someone said cosine similarity. Absolutely, yes. So when you're searching for all the related documents, you would need to know how many chunks did it search, number of chunks, and how many embeddings, like were the embeddings correctly, was the embeddings correctly stored? Were there any truncated? And also, how was the LLM call? What did the LLM respond with? Was the JSON structure right? Did it use any tool call in case if it was an agent? How was the memory looking like? Was there any leak? And finally, the golden data set, which we had earlier, we'll also be using the response from that golden data set and the response which was provided by the RAG and comparing that. You could also use confidence level for that to see if you're using LLM as eval. So the next one is going to be the governance catastrophe. It's pretty much the same. I'll give you an example for this. There was Air Canada where the chatbot actually talked about a refund that did not really exist. A person was booking international flight and they had some family relative pass away in a different country. So they were chatting with the chatbot of Air Canada, and Air Canada said that yes, you're going to have a refund of $500 because you're going on a bereavement, I think, travel. So when they got back, they were shocked to know that it was just a hallucination that did not really exist. Due to which they were sued for millions of dollars, and that's really not the best spot to be. Which is why we need to follow certain strategies to make sure the AI is not hallucinating, and we have the proof that the AI is taking the response from the correct source. So I would quickly go through these. Make sure that the PIs not expose PII such as SSN, your passport number, your driver's license, or your medical number. None of these needs should be seen by the users. It should not be leaked. Do not add any of these things in the prompt. And you need to have the PII redaction layer. This could be as simple as regex, or it could be very complicated for using packages. There should be no gaps in the audit trail. As I mentioned, make sure to store each and every stage of the RAG pipeline. And finally, the last few points, if there's an intern who's not supposed to see a document which is meant for executive committee, make sure you have the specific um, confidentiality status, which is set on that. If it's internal, if it's private, if it's confidential, make sure that you're not inadvertently giving access to people just because you have LLM and agents. And finally, these are the mitigation strategies, and we pretty much covered most of these. And I can switch quickly to GitHub and show how exactly it looks like. So in this case, we are seeing answer the following questions based only on the provided context, and we're not really doing much evaluation here. And then let me actually go towards the end here. Yeah. So the test query is Tesla autonomous driving regulatory risk. So we're seeing the result which comes up, and there's no really source. So there's absolutely no logging. Say, for example, you don't have any Cosmos DB or database that's storing all the logs as you build. So this is what you get the response. But if you have all of that logged, then you would also get the citations, and each of these paragraphs shows the citations from what document it came back from. So that's super important. And with respect to the last one, like how I mentioned, the role-based access control. So you would again go back to metadata for that, because you need to stamp each of these documents with what exactly are they and who can see what. You would also need that sort of matrix mapping, and you would set that here. For example, you have the user role. For example, the junior analyst cannot see compensation table and earnings announcement and things like that. So you could use restricted keywords. And also you could use the different executive base. For example, I would want to see the compensation of a analyst or a senior analyst or a VP, then I'd be able to see all of these documents just because it's in that matrix. So finally, everyone's able to see what they're supposed to, which is like here in this case, junior analyst is not able to access the compensation data because their access is denied due to the index matrix, which I just showed. Then the senior analyst is able to see only sufficient documents, and the executive, they can usually see all the documents. So that's the GitHub part of it. If you're interested, I've started to add a bunch of notebooks here in terms of tokenization, word tokenization. So this is still a work in progress. I can share this as well. All right, so I spoke a lot. I provided a lot of different scenarios, mitigation strategies. I'd like to wrap up here by showing this framework, which is the trust framework. Targeted use case, make sure you're not boiling the complete ocean. Make sure you start with a single use case. Secondly, have reliable metadata. Use subject matter experts for your prompting, and do scalable evaluation, have golden data sets. Finally, make sure all of your RAG pipelines are auditable.